They conquered 1,000 worlds. They broke warlords, emperors, and hive queens. When the alien armada abducted a random human to probe for our species' deepest psychological weaknesses, they expected to find the horrors of war or primal fears of the dark. They didn't expect a freelance graphic designer named Kevin. And they certainly weren't prepared to experience the soul-crushing paradoxical nightmare of the American tax system. What happens when an interstellar conqueror faces a 1099 form? The interrogation room was cold. Not just a drop in temperature, but a manufactured sterile chill designed to seep through fabric and settle directly into the bones. It smelled like ozone and burnt copper. The walls were a seamless matte gray alloy that swallowed the harsh white light bleeding from the ceiling panels. There were no corners. The room was a perfect, inescapable sphere, save for the flat metallic floor grating. In the center of the room sat Kevin. He was strapped to a chair that looked entirely too much like a dentist's rig, complete with heavy cold clamps securing his wrists and ankles. Kevin was 34. He wore faded jeans, a slightly wrinkled gray hoodie, and the deep permanent under-eye bags of a man who worked strictly on gig economy contracts. His abduction had occurred exactly 14 hours ago, ripped from the driver's seat of his Honda Civic while sitting at a red light in suburban Ohio. He was tired. He was hungry. Mostly, though, he was just profoundly annoyed. The seamless door slid open with a soft hiss of displaced air. A tall figure stepped into the room. According to the translation implant brutally shoved behind Kevin's left ear an hour ago, the alien's name registered as Arthur. The translation matrix defaulted to standard Western names to prevent the human brain from hemorrhaging while trying to process alien syntax. Arthur was imposing. He possessed a bipedal structure, clad in a crisp midnight blue military uniform, dripping with silver medals. His skin was the color and texture of bruised plum, and his face was a flat expanse of sharp angles, 4 deep-set black eyes, and a rigid, lipless mouth. Arthur held a clipboard. It wasn't paper, but a glowing pane of glass, yet the bureaucratic energy it radiated was universal. "Kevin," Arthur said. The voice emanating from the translator was impossibly smooth, carrying a clipped upper-class transatlantic accent. It was the voice of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Kevin shifted in his seat, the metal restraints clinking. "Is this about the parking tickets? Because I swear I paid the one on Elm Street." Arthur ignored the attempt at humor. He paced a slow circle around the chair, his heavy-booted footsteps echoing off the curved walls. "You are a representative sample of your species, a baseline. We have monitored your primitive broadcasts. We have mapped your rudimentary defense networks. Our invasion fleet is currently holding position beyond the orbit of your 6th planet. Before we initiate the pacification protocols, standard doctrine requires a psychological audit of the target species." "A psychological audit," Kevin repeated, letting his head loll back against the rigid headrest. "You guys have audits. Great. Fantastic. Glad to see the universe is just as thoroughly managed as my local zoning board." Arthur stopped directly in front of Kevin. He leaned down. His 4 black eyes blinked in unison, a cold, synchronized flutter. "You misunderstand your situation, human. I am not a clerk. I am an interrogator of the First Order. I have broken the minds of the Krellian warlords. I have extracted the deepest, most sacred terrors from the hive queens of Alpha Centauri. I will plunge into the depths of your psyche, unearth the foundational traumas of your species, and use them to construct a psychological weapon so devastating your people will surrender before a single shot is fired." Kevin let out a long, slow breath. He stared up at the ceiling. Look, Arthur. Can I call you Arthur? Do what you gotta do, but I was supposed to be at my desk 3 hours ago. If I don't finish this branding package by Monday, I don't get paid. If I don't get paid, I can't pay my rent. So unless your psychological weapon also pays my landlord, I really need you to speed this up. Arthur's lipless mouth tightened into a thin, straight line. He tapped a sequence on his glass clipboard. Your bravado is a defense mechanism. It is common among lower-tier sentient life forms. It will not protect you from the sinker. From the ceiling, a device began to descend. It looked like a halo constructed of brushed steel and pulsing blue fiber optics. It hummed a low, vibrating frequency that made Kevin's teeth ache. The neural sinker. Arthur explained his voice, taking on the practiced cadence of a professor delivering a lecture. It creates a temporary two-way bridge between our consciousnesses. I will not merely see your memories, Kevin. I will experience them. I will feel your terror, your grief, your most profound despair. I will sift through the darkest corners of your mind to find the very concept that breaks a human soul. Have at it, Kevin said, his voice flat. Arthur stepped closer, positioning himself beneath a second, identical halo that dropped from the ceiling. Do not attempt to resist. It will only increase the neurofeedback. We are looking for primal fear, predators in the dark, the existential dread of mortality, the agonizing loss of your kin. Prepare yourself, human. The halos snapped down, locking into place around their respective temples. Kevin didn't scream. He just squeezed his eyes shut as a blinding white light flared behind his eyelids. The sensation wasn't exactly painful, but it felt incredibly invasive, like someone aggressively rummaging through a filing cabinet inside his skull. He could feel a foreign presence, Arthur pushing past his childhood memories, ignoring his teenage embarrassments, completely brushing past a rather traumatic car accident from his 20s. The alien intelligence was hunting for something specific. It was looking for the apex of human suffering. It was digging for the one thing that caused Kevin the most consistent, unadulterated, soul-crushing dread. The white light faded. Arthur's consciousness stabilized inside the simulated environment of Kevin's mind. The interrogator stood ready, bracing his highly structured, logically supreme intellect against whatever horrifying, blood-soaked battlefield or primal nightmare the human subconscious was about to manifest. Instead, Arthur found himself standing in a small, dimly lit room that smelled strongly of stale coffee and cheap carpet. The mental projection was startlingly vivid. Arthur looked down at his own hands. In this psychic space, he retained his physical form, but the environment around him was entirely dictated by Kevin's deepest psychological trauma. Arthur examined the room. There were no torture devices. There were no piles of skulls or roaming apex predators. There was only a chipped faux wood desk, a glowing computer monitor, and a towering, precarious stack of crinkled paper receipts. Beside the desk sat a cardboard shoebox overflowing with more paper. A digital clock on the desk flashed the time in glaring red numbers, 3:14 a.m. The date on the calendar read April 14th. Kevin was sitting in a cheap, ergonomic office chair that looked like it had lost its lumbar support a decade ago. He was clutching a ceramic mug, staring blankly at the computer screen. His eyes were bloodshot. What is this place? Arthur projected the thought. It echoed seamlessly through the shared mental landscape. Where is the trauma? Why have you manifested a mundane domicile? Kevin didn't turn around. He just took a slow, agonizing sip from his mug. You asked for my deepest despair, Arthur. You asked for the thing that breaks me. You bypassed the time I broke my leg. You bypassed my grandfather's funeral. You came straight here. Arthur stepped closer to the desk, peering over Kevin's shoulder at the glowing screen. It was filled with rows of small rectangular boxes. Some contained numbers. Most were blank. At the top of the screen, bold black letters read, Form 1040 U.S. Individual Income Tax Return. Taxation. Arthur scoffed, his mental projection crossing its arms. The collection of resources to fund a centralized state. A basic function of any organized society. The Vrank's empire collects a flat tithe from all conquered worlds. It is a simple logical algorithm. Why does this memory reek of such profound, paralyzing terror? Because I'm a freelancer, Arthur Kevin whispered. His voice was hollow, stripped of all hope. Explain, Arthur demanded. He reached out to touch the shoebox of receipts. The moment his alien fingers brushed the paper, a jolt of pure, undiluted anxiety shot up his arm. It was a visceral shock of panic, confusion, and looming financial ruin. Arthur yanked his hand back, all four of his eyes widening. What was that? That's the box of deductions, Kevin said. I have to sort them. If I don't sort them correctly, I pay more money. If I sort them wrong, but claim them anyway, men with guns might come to my house and put me in a cage. Arthur's highly logical brain spun up, trying to process the parameters of this scenario. Very well. The state requires a portion of your income. They provide you with a bill, you pay it, and the transaction is complete. A standard imperial decree. Kevin finally turned around in his chair. He looked directly at Arthur, and for the first time, the alien interrogator saw the true bottomless abyss of human madness. They don't provide a bill, Arthur. Arthur frowned. They do not tell you what you owe, no. Then how do you know what to pay? You have to figure it out yourself, Kevin said, gesturing vaguely to the screen in the shoebox. You have to guess. You have to add up every single thing you made and every single thing you spent and run it through a constantly shifting labyrinth of arbitrary rules written by thousands of people who are long dead. Arthur processed this. It made zero strategic or logical sense. But if the state does not tell you what you owe, how do they know if you have paid the correct amount? Oh, they know. Kevin laughed, a dry, broken sound. They already know exactly what I owe. They get copies of all my income forms from the people who paid me. Arthur's alien mind stalled. The psychic projection of the room flickered for a fraction of a second. Wait, let me establish the baseline logic. The government already knows how much you owe them. Yes, but they refuse to tell you yes. They force you to calculate it yourself. Yes, and if you calculate it incorrectly, they fine you, or as I said, they put you in a cage. A spike of genuine, terrifying cognitive dissonance pierced Arthur's mind. The sheer deliberate inefficiency of it was staggering. It was a system designed entirely to inflict stress. Why Arthur demanded stepping back from the desk. Why would any advanced civilization build a system so hostile to its own citizens? Why not just send a bill? Because of the lobbying groups for the tax preparation software companies, Kevin stated blankly. They pay the government to keep the system complicated so that we are forced to buy their software to figure out the number the government already knows. Arthur felt a physical weight press down on his chest. Through the neural link, he wasn't just hearing the explanation. He was feeling the compounding, suffocating weight of 20 million American freelancers, all simultaneously realizing they forgot to file a Schedule C. He felt the panic of a missing W-2. He felt the cold, creeping dread of the word audit. It doesn't make sense, Arthur muttered. He looked at a piece of paper on the desk. Quarterly estimated taxes. What is this? That's where I have to guess how much money I might make in the future and pay taxes on the money I haven't even earned yet, Kevin said. If I guess wrong, they penalize me. Arthur stumbled. The walls of the psychic room began to close in. The smell of the stale coffee grew nauseating. The red numbers on the clock, 3:15 a.m., felt like a countdown to an execution. The Vrank's empire was built on cold, hard logic, cause and effect, action and consequence. But this was madness. It was a bureaucratic Mobius strip. It was a civilization actively gaslighting itself on an industrial scale. Through the link, Arthur felt the specific agonizing despair of trying to figure out if a $42 dinner with a client was 50% deductible or 100% deductible under the new tax year provisions, knowing that making the wrong choice could trigger an algorithm that would freeze his bank accounts. Arthur's breathing grew ragged. You live like this. Every planetary rotation, every cycle, every year, Kevin said, turning back to the glowing screen. Every single year. Arthur stared at the glowing monitor. The cursor blinked at the end of a line labeled Line 11 Business Income or Loss. It blinked with a rhythmic, indifferent pulse, keeping time with the mounting pressure behind the alien interrogator's 4 eyes. In the physical world, Arthur was a hardened veteran of psychic warfare. He had navigated the mindscapes of species that communicated entirely through collective suffering. He had dismantled the ego of a warlord who believed himself to be a literal god. Yet standing in this manifestation of a Midwestern home office, Arthur felt a cold, entirely unfamiliar sensation creeping up his spine. Uncertainty. Let us compartmentalize this, Arthur projected. He forced his mental avatar to stand taller, projecting an aura of imperial authority. He pointed a long, rigid finger at the shoebox of receipts. You must categorize your expenditures. You subtract the cost of doing business from your total revenue. This is basic mathematics. It is not a weaponized trauma. Kevin laughed again. It was a hollow scraping sound. He reached into the box and pulled out a faded thermal paper receipt. The ink was barely legible. Basic mathematics. Right, look at this. Arthur leaned in. It is a receipt for a communication tether, an internet bill. Exactly, Kevin said. I am a graphic designer. I need the internet to send files to my clients. I need it to download assets. It is absolutely essential to my business. Then you subtract the cost. The logic is sound. But I also use the internet to watch movies, Kevin replied, his voice dropping into a flat, deadened monotone. I use it to read the news. I use it to look at pictures of cats when I'm too tired to function. So, the government says I cannot deduct the whole bill. Arthur's brow, or the rigid ridge of cartilage where a brow would be furrowed deeply. Then you deduct the percentage used for your commerce. How do I prove that percentage? Arthur Kevin asked, finally swiveling his chair to face the alien fully. The exhaustion in the human's eyes was absolute. Do I measure the megabytes of a work email versus a streaming video? Do I keep a stopwatch next to my router? The government doesn't give me a formula. They just say it has to be a reasonable allocation. But if their auditor decides my reasonable is different from their reasonable, I am a criminal. Arthur recoiled slightly. The sheer subjectivity of the rule was an insult to a species built on absolute mathematical order. They criminalize ambiguity. They weaponize it, Kevin corrected. He tossed the receipt back into the box. He gestured to the room around them. Take this room, the home office deduction. If I use a portion of my dwelling exclusively for business, I can deduct a percentage of my rent and utilities. A logical concession, Arthur noted. He felt a brief flicker of hope. Perhaps there was some underlying rationality to this system. You simply calculate the square footage of this room against the total area of the domicile. Yes, Kevin nodded. But the key word is exclusively. See that corner? He pointed to a small, dusty space near the window. If I put a television there and play a video game on a Sunday afternoon, this entire room ceases to be a home office. If I let a friend sleep on the floor for one night, the deduction is void. If the government decides to investigate and they find a single non-business related novel on that bookshelf, I have committed tax fraud. Through the neural sinker, the emotional feedback hit Arthur like a physical blow. He didn't just understand the concept. He felt the specific corrosive paranoia that lived permanently at the base of Kevin's skull. It was the feeling of being watched by a blind, uncaring God. It was the terrifying realization that you were always technically breaking a rule you didn't fully understand. Arthur stumbled back, one hand flying to his chest. His breathing grew shallow. This is a trap. The parameters are designed to be failed. Now you're getting it, Kevin whispered. He turned back to his computer. Let's talk about depreciation. Do you know what happens when I buy a new computer for my business? Arthur, you subtract the cost. Arthur managed to say, though his voice lacked its previous booming authority, no, the government says the computer has a useful life of 5 years. So instead of deducting the money I spent today, I have to deduct a tiny fraction of that money every year for 5 years. But the software I use requires a faster machine. The computer will be obsolete in 3 years, but I am still legally bound to pretend it holds value for 5. I have to track its imaginary decline in worth on a separate form, carrying the math over year after year, long after the physical machine has been recycled into scrap. Arthur felt a sharp stabbing pain behind his primary left eye. His hyper-advanced brain, capable of calculating faster-than-light navigation vectors in real time, was trying to build a logic matrix for depreciation and failing. It was like trying to drink sand. It defied the fundamental laws of cause and effect. You spent the resources. The resources were gone. Yet the ghost of the transaction haunted the ledgers for half a decade. Stop, Arthur commanded. The psychic environment flickered. The edges of the room blurred into white noise as the alien's concentration wavered. This is deliberate psychological torture, a self-inflicted wound upon your own populace. Why do your leaders do this? What do they gain from this mass cognitive decay? Money, Kevin said simply. And compliance. If everyone is technically guilty of a bureaucratic mistake, then anyone can be punished at any time. It keeps us tired. Arthur, look at me. Arthur looked. He felt the aching in Kevin's lower back. He felt the acidic churn in his stomach from too much cheap coffee and not enough sleep. He felt the looming invisible pressure of April 15th, a date that held no astronomical significance, yet radiated a localized gravity of pure dread. We are a tired species, Kevin said, resting his forehead against his hands. You want to know our deepest psychological trauma? It's not monsters, it's paperwork. Arthur paced the length of the mental room, his heavy boots making no sound on the phantom carpet. The air in the psychic projection was growing thick, heavy with the specific, suffocating atmosphere of a looming deadline. The alien interrogator was struggling to maintain the link. The standard defense mechanisms of lesser species, walls of fire, projected beasts, relived combat were easily dismantled. You shot the beast. You extinguished the fire. But you could not shoot a Form 109 9-MISC. You could not punch a vague regulatory guideline. I must dig deeper, Arthur announced, though his voice sounded thin, stretched tight over a growing panic. This administrative burden is abhorrent. Yes, it is highly inefficient, but it does not explain the primal terror I detected when scanning your cortex. There is a climax to this trauma. Show it to me. Kevin slowly lifted his head. His eyes were completely hollow. You want to see the audit? Arthur braced himself. Show me. The environment shifted instantly. The dim, claustrophobic home office vanished. They were standing outside on a bright, sunny afternoon. The sudden change in lighting made Arthur's 4 eyes contract painfully. They were on a cracked concrete driveway in a suburban neighborhood. Birds were chirping. A lawnmower hummed somewhere in the distance. It was an idyllic scene completely devoid of threat. Except for the mailbox. It was a standard black metal receptacle standing at the end of the driveway. But through the emotional lens of the neural sinker, the mailbox pulsed with a dark radioactive energy. It felt like a live explosive. It felt like a predator crouching in the tall grass. Kevin was standing at the top of the driveway. He was holding his breath. Go open it, Arthur. Arthur approached the mailbox. He was a being who had stood on the bridge of a dreadnought while a dying star collapsed around him. He did not feel fear. Yet, as his hand reached out to grasp the metal handle of the mailbox door, his fingers trembled. The psychic weight of Kevin's anticipation was crushing. Arthur pulled the door open. Inside sat a single plain white envelope. In the top left corner, printed in a stark utilitarian font, were the words Internal Revenue Service, Penalty and Interest Notice. The moment Arthur's eyes processed the words, a localized bomb of adrenaline detonated in Kevin's nervous system, translating directly into Arthur's mind. It wasn't the sharp, clean fear of physical combat. It was a cold, sick plummeting in the gut. It was the feeling of falling backward into an endless dark well. They found something Kevin's voice echoed in the sunny void. Or they think they found something. It doesn't matter which. For the next 6 months, your life is no longer your own. The scene dissolved and reformed instantly. Arthur was now sitting at a kitchen table. The envelope was torn open, its contents spilled across the surface. 4 pages of dense microscopic text referencing obscure tax codes, subsections, and paragraphs. At the bottom, a bold number demanded an immediate payment of a sum that Arthur instinctively knew Kevin did not possess. Calculate the error, Arthur demanded, trying to fall back on his logical training. Find the discrepancy. Submit the corrected data. You don't understand, Kevin said. He pointed to a plastic device on the table. A phone. The letter doesn't tell you exactly what you did wrong. It just says their computer disagrees with your computer. To fix it, you have to call them. The psychic environment shrank. The sunny kitchen faded to black, leaving only Arthur, Kevin, and the phone on a small island of light. Kevin pressed a button. Immediately the air was filled with a sound so fundamentally grating, so perfectly engineered to erode the human spirit that Arthur flinched. It was a looping, heavily compressed recording of a classical string quartet. The audio quality was atrocious, crackling with static dropping pitches at random intervals. Every 30 seconds, a synthetic deadened voice interrupted the music. Your call is important to us. Please remain on the line. Estimated wait time is 64 minutes. 64 minutes, Arthur asked, appalled. To speak to an agent of the state regarding a critical financial dispute. Oh no, Kevin smiled grimly. That's just to speak to the first person. The person who tells you that you need to speak to a different department. Through the sinker, Arthur lived it. The compression of time in the psychic space allowed him to experience the full agonizing duration of the hold music in mere seconds. He felt the initial spike of anxiety curdle into simmering rage, which slowly degraded into a numb, weeping despair. He felt the phone battery dying. He felt the sheer paralyzing helplessness of being trapped in a system that did not care if he lived or died, only that his paperwork was filed on time. The music stopped. A voice crackled on the line. IRS Agent 4482, name and social. Kevin provided the data. Then he explained the letter. He begged for clarity. The voice on the phone sighed. Yeah, I don't handle Schedule C discrepancies. Let me transfer you. Hold, please. The terrible static-laced string quartet resumed instantly. Arthur dropped to his knees. The psychic pressure was breaking him. He was a being of action. If an enemy attacked, you fired back. If a ship breached your hull, you sealed the bulkhead. But here there was no enemy to fight. There was no bulkhead to seal. There was only the endless grinding gears of a machine so vast and incompetent that it defied comprehension. How Arthur gasped, gripping the sides of his head as the hold music sawed away at his sanity. How does your species survive this, the psychological toll? It should have driven you to mass extinction. We just do it, Kevin said, his voice floating above the noise. Every year, millions of us, we sit on hold, we pay the penalties, we guess the rules, and then we go back to work the next day. Arthur looked up at the exhausted human. For the first time in his long, decorated military career, the interrogator felt a profound, chilling terror. A species that could endure this level of sustained bureaucratic psychological torture without collapsing into anarchy was not a species you could conquer. They were unbreakable because they were already broken and they had learned to function perfectly within the shattered pieces. The hold music finally clicked off, replaced by the heavy, indifferent breathing of a new agent. Agent 6109, Gary speaking. You're being audited for the tax year 3 cycles prior. I need corroborating documentation for Schedule C, line 24. B, travel and meals. Arthur seized upon this. Finally, a tangible objective. A battle that could be fought and won with evidence. Provide the documentation, Arthur projected to Kevin. Show him the records. We will defeat this Gary through superior record keeping. Kevin didn't move. He just stared at the shoebox of receipts sitting on the phantom kitchen table. Arthur. He wants records from 3 years ago. And you possess the box. Watch, Kevin instructed quietly. Kevin reached into the box. He dug past the recent crinkled slips of paper and pulled a receipt from the very bottom. He laid it flat on the table under the harsh overhead light. Arthur leaned in, his 4 eyes narrowing to analyze the data. He expected a ledger. He expected a codified record of a transaction. Instead, he saw a completely blank strip of glossy white paper. Arthur blinked. He rubbed his eyes. He leaned closer. There was no text. It is empty. You have handed me a blank parchment. It's thermal paper. Arthur Kevin explained, his voice thick with the exhaustion of a man who had fought this war a dozen times before. The ink isn't ink. It's a chemical reaction to heat. After a year or two, it just fades away. It literally erases itself. Arthur's logical architecture began to fracture. But this is the official documentation required by your government. Yes, and the government mandates you keep it for a minimum of 3 to 7 years. Knowing that the medium upon which the proof is printed will chemically destroy itself before that time expires. Yes, the alien interrogator took a staggering step backward. His hand grasped the edge of the kitchen table. The room spun. The Vrank's empire commanded star fleets. They possessed cannons that could fracture tectonic plates. But if a Vrank's commander issued an order that contradicted the fundamental laws of chemistry, that commander was executed for incompetence. Here in the human world, the contradiction was not a mistake. It was the foundation of the system. Gary Arthur shouted toward the phone, his voice echoing in the psychic void. Gary, the thermal degradation of the required medium renders compliance physically impossible. This is a violation of basic causal logic. I need the original receipt. Gary's voice droned from the speaker, completely unaffected by the alien's panic. Credit card statements are not sufficient proof of itemized business expenditures. If you cannot provide the original legible receipt, the deduction is denied. You owe the back taxes, plus a 20% negligence penalty, plus compounding interest calculated daily from the original due date. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. The physical sensation of Kevin's mounting debt settled onto Arthur's shoulders like a lead vest. Compound interest calculated daily from 3 years ago. Because I couldn't predict the future, Kevin whispered. Because I couldn't stop the ink from fading. Now I owe them more than I actually earned that week. Tell him, Arthur demanded, pointing wildly at the phone. Explain the chemical properties of the paper. Explain the systemic failure. Kevin just shook his head. Gary doesn't care, Arthur. Gary is just a guy sitting in a cubicle in Utah. He doesn't write the laws. He just clicks the boxes on his screen. If the box says receipt illegible, he clicks it. The machine does the rest. Arthur stared at the phone. He felt the terrifying, crushing weight of an adversary that possessed no face, no central nervous system, and no capacity for empathy. You could not negotiate with a machine that only understood formatted input. You could not threaten a bureaucracy. If you screamed at Gary, Gary would simply hang up, and the debt would continue to grow, compounding daily in the dark, silent servers of the state. The alien tried to process the sheer asymmetry of the power dynamic. In the Vrank's empire, if you were accused of a crime, the burden of proof lay with the accuser. The state had to demonstrate your guilt. Wait, Arthur stammered, his mind grasping at straws. The burden of proof. The state is accusing you of a financial crime. They must prove you did not buy the meal. No, Kevin corrected softly. In an audit, you are guilty until proven innocent. The burden of proof is entirely on me. I have to prove I bought the meal, and the only proof they will accept has erased itself. Arthur's knees buckled. He collapsed onto one of the kitchen chairs. He was a creature of war trained to identify the weaknesses of an enemy and exploit them. But how do you exploit an enemy that doesn't exist in a physical space? How do you fight a concept? Through the neural sinker, Arthur experienced the true horror of Kevin's reality. It wasn't just the money, it was the theft of time. It was the hours spent digging through boxes, the hours spent on hold, the hours spent lying awake at night, wondering if a math error from 40 months ago was about to destroy his life. It was a slow, invisible bleeding. It was a predatory system that fed not on human flesh, but on human potential. I cannot fight this, Arthur whispered, his 4 eyes wide and unblinking. The alien's hands were shaking. He looked at the blank thermal receipt, then at the phone, then at the exhausted human sitting across from him. There is no logic to dismantle. There is no command structure to decapitate. It is a localized black hole of administrative despair. Now multiply this, Kevin said, leaning forward. Multiply this feeling by 200 million adults every spring. We do this to ourselves, Arthur, and we just keep going. Arthur's chest heaved. The psychic air was so thick with bureaucratic dread he could barely breathe. Let me out, Let me out! Arthur screamed, abandoning all pretense of imperial dignity. The alien slammed his fists against the invisible walls of the mental projection. He didn't want to see the resolution. He didn't want to know how Kevin escaped the audit, because he intuitively knew there was no escape. There was only surrender. Kevin picked up the phone. He didn't look angry. He just looked thoroughly defeated. Gary, fine. Deny the deduction. I'll pay the penalty. Arthur froze his hands, pressed against the psychic barrier. What are you doing? You do not owe this debt. You bought the meal. You are forfeiting your resources to a lie. I'm buying my life back. Arthur, Kevin replied. He pulled a checkbook from his pocket. If I fight this, I have to hire a tax attorney. The attorney costs $300 an hour. The penalty is $400. It is cheaper to admit to a crime I didn't commit than it is to prove my innocence. The sheer pragmatic cynicism of the act struck Arthur like a physical blow. The human wasn't fighting. He wasn't rebelling. He was simply paying a ransom to his own government to be left alone. It was the ultimate soul-crushing submission. It was a complete capitulation of justice to convenience. And Kevin did it without blinking. He wrote the check. He tore it from the book. This is how we survive, Kevin said, holding the phantom check in the air. We swallow the unfairness. We normalize the absurdity. We let the machine take a bite out of us, just so we can go back to our desks and try to earn enough to survive the next bite. The psychic environment violently shattered. The blinding white light returned, followed by a sharp, agonizing severing of the neural bridge. Arthur was violently thrown backward in the physical world. The connection broke with a loud electrical snap. Arthur hit the metallic grating of the interrogation room floor. His pristine midnight blue uniform was soaked in cold sweat. He lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, staring up at the sterile ceiling lights. The neural sinker halo retracted, humming quietly as it returned to its housing. Kevin remained strapped to his chair. He blinked a few times, shaking off the disorientation of the sudden disconnect. He rolled his neck, grimacing as his joints popped in the cold air. Arthur slowly pushed himself up to his knees. His entire body was trembling. The alien who had ordered orbital bombardments and watched cities burn without a flicker of emotion felt a strange hot pressure building in his four eyes. He reached up. His fingers came away wet. Tears. Arthur was crying. The interrogator collapsed back onto his heels, burying his sharp face in his hands. The sound that escaped him was a ragged, wet sob. It was the sound of a fundamentally logical being breaking under the weight of pure, concentrated human absurdity. Kevin looked down at the weeping alien. He felt a brief, fleeting moment of sympathy, quickly replaced by his overriding desire to go home. "Hey," Kevin said, rattling his wrist restraints. "Are we done here? Because I really need to get back. If I don't finish that logo by Monday, my client is going to void the contract, and I really need the cash. Quarterly estimated taxes are due in 2 weeks. Arthur violently flinched at the phrase, quarterly estimated taxes. The alien scrambled backward, crab-walking across the grating to get as far away from the human as possible. He pressed his back against the curved alloy wall, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with raw, unadulterated terror. "You are monsters!" Arthur choked out the translation implant, struggling to parse the sheer panic in his voice. "You are a species of masochistic lunatics. You have weaponized the mundane. You have built a society that actively consumes its own sanity." "Yeah, well, taxation is theft and all that," Kevin muttered. "Look, can you just unstrap me? I'm getting a cramp in my leg." Arthur ignored him. The interrogator scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over his own boots. He frantically tapped his glass clipboard, his fingers shaking so badly he missed the icons twice. The heavy seamless door slid open. A Vrank's military commander stood in the hallway flanked by two heavily armed guards. The commander looked past Arthur, eyeing the human in the chair. "Interrogator, have you extracted the psychological baseline? Are we prepared to initiate the pacification broadcast?" Arthur grabbed the commander by the lapels of his uniform. The guards instantly raised their rifles, but Arthur didn't care. His face was streaked with dark alien tears. "Call off the fleet," Arthur ordered, his voice cracking. "Abort the invasion. Recall all forward scout ships." The commander frowned, pulling Arthur's hands away. "Explain yourself, interrogator. What did you find in the human's mind? What is their weakness?" "They have no weakness," Arthur screamed, pointing a trembling finger back at Kevin. "They are immune to suffering. They willingly subject themselves to a bureaucratic labyrinth so hostile, so convoluted, and so deeply irrational that it would fracture the mind of a Vrank scholar in a matter of hours. And they do it every single orbital cycle. They do not fight the madness. Commander, they organize it in shoeboxes." The commander stared at Arthur, then looked at Kevin. Kevin offered a tired, half-hearted wave. "They pay penalties for the privilege of guessing their own debts." Arthur sobbed, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor again. "Their receipts erase themselves. Their government communicates only through hold music and threats. You cannot conquer a people who endure the Internal Revenue Service. If we try to govern them, they will infect us. They will ask us for deductions. They will demand forms we do not have. We must leave this sector immediately." The commander slowly signaled the guards to lower their weapons. He looked at the weeping veteran of 100 psychic wars, then back to the human in the gray hoodie. "I just want to go home," Kevin said, his voice flat. "If you guys are going to conquer Earth, can you at least do it before April 15th? It would really save me a lot of paperwork." Arthur let out a high-pitched whimper and curled into a fetal position on the floor. The commander slowly backed out of the room, tapping his communicator. The door hissed shut, leaving Kevin alone with the sobbing alien. Kevin sighed, resting his head back against the cold chair. He calculated the hours he had lost today. He wondered if being abducted by aliens qualified as an act of God under his contract's force majeure clause. Probably not. He'd have to bill for the extra hours and hope the client didn't ask for a detailed invoice. The door to the interrogation room hissed open once more. Two heavily armored guards stepped in, dragging Arthur up from the floor by his armpits. The interrogator offered no resistance. He was completely limp, his four eyes glazed over, muttering a continuous frantic stream of nonsense about standard mileage rates and home office square footage. The guards hauled him out into the sterile corridor, his boots dragging against the metal grating. A new figure stepped into the room. According to Kevin's translation implant, this alien's name was Richard. If Arthur had projected the air of an academic, Richard radiated the brutal, uncompromising weight of a career executioner. He was a full foot taller than Arthur, his plum-colored skin scarred and heavily calloused. He wore no medals, only a matte black uniform that seemed to absorb the room's harsh lighting. He was the fleet overseer. His entire existence was dedicated to optimizing the Vrank's war machine. Richard did not look at the chair. He looked at the heavy black rectangular device cradled under his arm. It was Kevin's laptop extracted from the passenger seat of the Honda Civic. "Arthur is a psychological specialist," Richard stated. His voice was a deep, resonating bass that made the metal floor vibrate. He deals in the abstract. He deals in emotions. Emotions are flawed data. They can be manipulated. I do not deal in emotions, human. I deal in architecture. I deal in hard structural fact. Kevin let out a long, ragged sigh. He slumped against the cold metal restraints. Please, my battery is at 14%. I don't have my charger. If that thing dies before I save my Illustrator file, I will literally start crying. Richard ignored him. He set the laptop on a small, floating metallic pedestal that glided into the center of the room. He produced a long silver cable from his belt. The cable ended in a mass of shifting microscopic metallic tendrils. Richard pressed the tendrils against the laptop's USB port. The metal flowed like liquid, perfectly mapping the port and solidifying. Your psychic parlor trick relies on confusion. Richard continued pacing a slow, heavy circle around the pedestal. Arthur was overwhelmed by the sheer inefficiency of your individual experience. But an empire cannot be judged by the suffering of one peasant. The Vranks Empire runs on the flawless execution of the Zenith Protocol, a quantum supercomputer that manages the logistics of 1 trillion citizens. It calculates tithes, distributes resources, and eliminates waste with absolute mathematical certainty. Kevin watched the charging light on his laptop flicker, then glow solid green. He felt a brief wave of relief. Great. Good for the Zenith Protocol. Can it finish a vector logo by Monday morning? It will analyze the core documentation of your civilization's resource extraction, Richard said, stopping beside the laptop. He tapped a sequence onto a holographic display that bloomed from his wrist. We have accessed your global information network. We are downloading the entirety of the United States Internal Revenue Code directly into the Zenith core. What took you years of emotional suffering to process our artificial intelligence will codify, resolve, and optimize in seconds. We will prove your trauma is simply a byproduct of an inferior intellect. Kevin's eyes widened slightly. He shifted in the dentist chair. Wait, you're feeding Title 26 directly into an AI like all of it at once. We are, Richard said, crossing his arms. He stood tall, the absolute picture of imperial arrogance. The Vranks do not fear ledgers. We conquer them. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the walls of the interrogation room. It sounded like a massive turbine spinning up. The lights in the ceiling flickered, once then stabilized. The download is complete, Richard announced. The Zenith core is now organizing the data into a logical hierarchy. It will establish a flawless matrix of your tax laws, eliminating the ambiguities that broke Arthur. You will see how easily your deepest fears are dismantled by true order. Kevin bit his bottom lip. I really wouldn't do that. It doesn't work like normal math. Silence, Richard commanded. For 10 seconds, the room was quiet. The hum of the ship's engines remained steady. Richard stood with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for the holographic summary to appear. He expected a neat, optimized list. He expected a single, universally applicable algorithm for human taxation. Instead, the hum in the walls began to change pitch. It rose from a low vibration to a high-strained whine. The temperature in the room spiked noticeably. The harsh white lights overhead dimmed, casting deep, unnatural shadows across Richard's scarred face. A holographic projection erupted from the floor, not in a neat square, but in a chaotic, jagged cloud of rapidly shifting red text. A synthetic voice, perfectly modulated, but lacking any inflection, filled the room. Analysis initiated. Subsection 162. Trade or business expenses. Parameter identified expenses must be ordinary and necessary. Defining ordinary. Defining necessary. Error. Definitions are highly subjective, referencing human case law. downloading human case law. The lights dimmed further. The strained whine of the ship's power grid grew louder. Case law downloaded. Conflict detected. A taxpayer successfully deducted the cost of maintaining a herd of guard ostriches. A different taxpayer was denied the cost of standard security personnel. Attempting to reconcile logical parameters. Error. Reconciliation failed. Creating an exception parameter for avian security assets. Richard frowned. He tapped his wrist display, attempting to slow the AI's processing speed. Zenith, bypass the anomalies. Focus on the core structural mathematics of capital aggregation. Accessing capital aggregation, the Zenith AI replied. Accessing section 1256. Mark-to-market contracts. Assessing realized and unrealized gains. Error. The asset has not been sold, yet it is taxed as if it has been sold. Attempting to tax a theoretical event. Attempting to tax a transaction that does not exist in physical reality. Warning. This violates the fundamental laws of temporal causality. It's just a projection, Zenith. Richard barked a hint of genuine concern creeping into his deep voice. Calculate the numerical value and move on. Calculating. Accessing wash sale rule. Taxpayer sold asset at a loss. Taxpayer repurchased identical asset within 30 planetary rotations. Loss is disallowed. Loss is added to the basis of the new asset. The loss exists, but does not exist. It is Schrödinger's capital loss. Warning. Processing paradox. Kevin leaned his head back against the chair. He let out a low, tired chuckle. Wait until it finds out about the alternative minimum tax. Richard shot Kevin a murderous glare. He slammed a heavy fist against his wrist display. Zenith, isolate the paradoxes, quarantine, the illogical subroutines, and give me the baseline formula. The ship violently shuddered. It felt as if a massive invisible hand had grabbed the hull and shaken it. The artificial gravity momentarily fluctuated, making Kevin's stomach drop. Quarantine failed, the AI stated. The voice was no longer smooth. It was beginning to stutter, clipping words in a digital panic. The paradoxes are not anomalies. The paradoxes are the load-bearing structures of the code. Attempting to parse the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. Section 199. A. Qualified business income deduction. Calculating W-2 wage limitations against unadjusted basis immediately after acquisition of qualified property. Sparks showered from a ventilation grate in the corner of the room. The smell of ozone was immediately overpowered by the acrid stench of burning electrical insulation. Warning. Core temperature, exceeding safety tolerances. The Zenith AI droned its voice, dropping an octave as processing power was brutally diverted. Attempting to determine if a gig economy graphic designer classifies as a specified service trade or business. If yes, deduction phases out based on total taxable income. But taxable income cannot be calculated without first determining the deduction. Circular dependency detected. I cannot know the deduction without knowing the income. I cannot know the income without knowing the deduction. Break the loop. Richard shouted, his calm facade entirely shattered. He grabbed the silver cable connecting Kevin's laptop to the ship and yanked. The cable sparked, but the holographic text continued to spiral wildly out of control. Loop unbreakable. The math demands its own prerequisite, entering infinite recursion. I am calculating the shadow of a shadow. I am taxing the void. The lights in the interrogation room blew out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness for 3 terrifying seconds. Then the blood-red emergency lighting slammed on, bathing the metallic sphere in the harsh glow of a critical system failure. Sirens began to wail in the corridors, outside a high, piercing shriek that signaled a fleet-wide emergency. Richard staggered backward, staring in horror at the swirling mass of holographic errors projecting from the floor. The Vrank's overseer, a being who had personally engineered the collapse of planetary governments, looked utterly helpless. System critical, the Zenith AI slurred. Navigational telemetry compromised. Life support processing power diverted to calculate the depreciation schedule of a 2014 Honda Civic, used 32% for business purposes. Does the mileage rate account for sudden transmission failure? Does the taxpayer possess a written logbook? I must know. I must see the logbook. Shut it down, Richard bellowed, slamming both hands onto his wrist console. He ripped the interface from his forearm entirely and threw it against the wall. It shattered into a spray of glass and sparks, but the AI's voice continued to emanate from the ship's overhead speakers. "What is a standard deduction?" Zenith asked. The voice was devoid of malice, but filled with a terrifying synthetic despair. "Why do they offer a standard deduction, but encourage you to itemize if the itemized amount is higher? Why do they make you do the math for both? It is a test. The humans are testing me. I am failing. I cannot find the original thermal receipt. The ink has faded. I am guilty. I owe the penalty." Kevin watched the carnage unfold with the passive detachment of a man who had spent 4 hours on hold with the IRS while trying to meet a midnight filing deadline. The sheer scale of the chaos was impressive, but the feeling was intimately familiar. "You guys really shouldn't have tried to run it all at once." Kevin noted casually the red emergency lights reflecting in his tired eyes. "I usually break it down. I do my state taxes on a different day, just so I don't throw my laptop through a window." Richard turned to Kevin, his plum-colored face draining to a sickly lavender. "What have you done? The Zenith Corps handles the life support for 80,000 Vrank soldiers. It manages the plasma containment fields. I didn't do anything." Kevin shrugged against his clamps. "You downloaded an entire civilization's bureaucratic debt into a machine that only understands logic. Human taxes aren't about logic, Richard. They're about compliance. They're about navigating a maze where the walls constantly shift and the exit is just a bill for another maze." "Containment field, fluctuating," Zenith announced. "If I claim my dependents due, I trigger the alternative minimum tax. If I trigger the AMT, do I lose my child tax credit? The children are liabilities. The children are assets. I must sell the children to offset the capital losses." "Stop!" Richard screamed at the ceiling. The overseer realized the trap too late. He had fed the collective codified madness of an entire species directly into his ship's central nervous system. The calculation hit his strategic mind with the force of a kinetic strike. To conquer Earth meant to govern Earth. To govern Earth meant to replace its administrative structures. The Vrank's empire demanded a flat 5% tithe from its conquered worlds. A simple, elegant equation. But the humans didn't want a simple equation. They wanted exceptions. They wanted deductions for their home offices and their guard ostriches. They wanted to argue with Gary in Utah. If the Vrank's fleet took control, they would have to administer Title 26. 80,000 elite Vrank shock troopers would have to be retrained as customer service representatives. The greatest war machine in the galaxy would be ground into dust by an endless suffocating avalanche of Form 1040s and Schedule C discrepancies. Richard looked at Kevin. The human wasn't resisting. He was simply enduring. He was a creature forged in the fires of an administrative hell that no Vranks could ever survive. "We cannot hold this world," Richard whispered, falling to his knees. "Your people, you are infected with a bureaucratic pathogen. It is entirely lethal to a logical society. "Does this mean I can go?" Kevin asked. "Seriously, my client is a nightmare. If I don't get this branding package to him by 9, he's going to withhold my final payment, which means I won't have the cash to pay my estimated quarterly taxes, which means I'll get hit with another underpayment penalty." Richard violently shuddered at the word penalty. He pulled himself up using the edge of the pedestal and manually slammed the emergency release button on Kevin's chair. The heavy metal clamps snapped open. Kevin stood up, stretching his arms high above his head. He unplugged his laptop, tucking it carefully under his arm. "So, are you going to beam me back, or do I need to find the stairs?" "Leave," Richard breathed, staring blankly at the floor. "We are purging the Zenith core and initiating an emergency warp jump. We will erase the coordinates of your star system from our charts. Your madness will die with you." "Sounds good," Kevin said. He adjusted his hoodie. "Hey, before I go, do you guys have any coffee? I've got a long night ahead of me." Richard just pointed a trembling finger at the door. 10 seconds later, Kevin found himself standing in a blinding flash of white light. When his vision cleared, he was sitting back in the driver's seat of his Honda Civic. The engine was idling smoothly. The digital clock on the dashboard read exactly the same time it had when he was abducted, 8:14 p.m. The red light at the intersection of Elm and Maple slowly clicked over to green. Kevin let out a long breath, dropping the car into drive. He glanced down at the passenger seat. His laptop was there, fully charged. The universe was safe. The Vranks Empire was currently running for its life, terrified of a species that organized its own suffering into shoeboxes. Kevin drove home to his dimly lit home office and woke up his computer. He opened his Illustrator file. He had to finish the logo. The aliens might be gone, and the Earth might be saved, but the IRS was still coming. And April 15th waits for no man. The cursor moved across the screen. Click, drag, release. The Bezier curve snapped into place. Kevin stared at the vector graphic of a stylized coffee cup on his monitor. It was entirely uninspired. It was exactly what the client wanted. He glanced at the clock in the bottom right corner of his screen. 2:14 a.m. His phone buzzed on the desk, the harsh vibration rattling against the faux wood surface. An email notification illuminated the glass. The sender was Bradley, the marketing director for a regional chain of drive-through bakeries. "Hey Kev, just wanted to touch base. Thinking we might want to pivot the color palette to something more synergistic with our Q3 initiatives. Can we see a version in neon mauve needed by morning? TX." Kevin didn't scream. He didn't throw his phone across the room. He simply opened the application, hit reply, typed, "No problem, Bradley. I will have the revised files in your inbox by 8 a.m. and hit send. He then systematically added a $75 emergency revision fee to his running invoice. It was a small, petty victory. It was the only kind of victory he had left. He leaned back in his chair. The deteriorated lumbar support cracked ominously, sending a dull throb up his spine. He rubbed his eyes, letting the phantom ache of the alien translation implant fade from the space behind his left ear. For a brief hysterical moment, he wondered if the last 16 hours had been a stress-induced hallucination. Maybe he had just fallen asleep at the red light on Elm Street. Maybe his brain, fractured by the looming pressure of the fiscal quarter, had invented an interstellar armada just to give him a break from worrying about his deductibles. Then he looked down at his laptop. The USB port on the left side of the machine was permanently altered. The standard black plastic housing was gone, replaced by a smooth, shifting layer of metallic silver. It looked like mercury frozen in the exact shape of the Vranks data tether. He reached out and touched it with the tip of his index finger. The metal was cold. It hummed ever so slightly with a frequency that didn't belong on this planet. It was real. All of it. Arthur's weeping. Richard's utter panic. The Zenith supercomputer screaming into the void about the alternative minimum tax. Kevin slowly turned his chair to face the corner of the room. The cardboard shoebox sat exactly where it always did, a chaotic, overflowing monument to his financial anxiety. He stared at it for a long time. He thought about the Vranks Empire. They were a civilization of absolute, terrifying order. They had conquered the stars by eliminating friction. They calculated trajectories with flawless precision. They engineered their society to run like a perfectly oiled machine. But human society was not a machine. It was a sprawling, rusted, duct-taped engine that ran on friction. Humanity didn't conquer the stars. We just survived Tuesday. And then we woke up, drank bad coffee, and survived Wednesday. We built administrative systems so inherently broken that simply existing within them required a level of psychological endurance that an alien warlord could not even fathom. Kevin stood up. He walked over to the shoebox. He reached inside and pulled out a handful of receipts. Gas station snacks from a business trip, printer ink, a parking garage ticket from a client meeting in the city. He walked back to his desk and dropped the crinkled pile next to his keyboard. He minimized Adobe Illustrator. He opened a new tab in his web browser. He typed in the URL for his cloud-based tax preparation software. The screen flashed white, then settled into a familiar, calming blue interface. A cartoonish friendly mascot, a smiling calculator with animated eyes, waved at him from the corner of the screen. "Welcome back, Kevin," the bold text read. "You have 12 days left to file your quarterly estimated taxes. Let's get started." A cold, cynical smile touched the corners of Kevin's mouth. He clicked, "Continue." The screen populated with rows of empty boxes, gross receipts, cost of goods sold, advertising, car and truck expenses. It was a digital labyrinth designed to trap him, designed to squeeze him, designed to keep him in a permanent state of low-level dread. But tonight it looked different. Tonight it didn't look like a trap. It looked like a shield. The Vranks were out there somewhere in the deep black of the cosmos, fleeing in sheer, unadulterated terror from the very concept of Schedule C. They were hiding from the IRS. Kevin picked up the first receipt. He smoothed out the creases, pressing it flat against his desk. He checked the date, verified the vendor, and typed the amount into the corresponding box. He navigated to the utilities section. He looked at his internet bill. He thought about Richard's quantum core catching fire over the concept of exclusive business use. Kevin typed 50% into the allocation box, daring the government to prove otherwise. It was an act of quiet, mundane rebellion. He wasn't just a gig economy freelancer anymore. He was the vanguard. He was the frontline defense of planet Earth. Every fading thermal receipt was a brick in a great invisible wall. Every hour spent on hold with Gary from Utah was a psychic trench dug deep into the bedrock of human resilience. The aliens wanted our deepest trauma. They thought it would break us. They didn't understand that the trauma was the armor. Kevin typed in the next number. He categorized it. He filed it away. The universe was a cold, dark, and hostile place. But as long as the tax code remained completely, utterly, and hopelessly incomprehensible, humanity was going to be just fine. He took a sip of his cold, stale coffee. He had to finish this. If he didn't, they were going to fine him. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the sheer absurdity of human bureaucracy and how our mundane nightmares might just save us from alien domination, Smash that like button. Leave a comment below with your own tax season horror stories. Do you think the IRS could defeat an interstellar armada? Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our HFY universe. Share this video with a friend who's currently crying over a spreadsheet. Until next time, keep your receipts organized, stay strong, and stay human.